Ukraine waited for Russian commanders to celebrate, then blew up Russia's floating fortress. The war in Ukraine has reached a point where timing matters more than firepower. One moment of confidence, one feeling of safety, and everything can change. That's exactly what happened here. Let's get into the details. In the quiet darkness of the early morning on August 28, 2025, the waters of Temryuk Bay were deceptively calm. Located deep within the Sea of Azov, this area had long been considered a sanctuary for the Russian Black Sea Fleet, a rear area shielded by the Crimean Peninsula and layers of coastal defense systems. For years, Moscow had operated under the assumption that while the open Black Sea might be contested, the Azov Sea was an internal Russian lake, impenetrable to Ukrainian naval assets. That assumption was about to be shattered in a way that would rewrite naval doctrine for the 21st century. At Military Pier No. 2, the Bayan M-class corvette, a Project 21631 vessel, sat motionless. This was not just any ship. It was a floating fortress, a compact but deadly missile carrier that had become the backbone of Russia's long-range strike capabilities. With a price tag hovering near $80 million, the corvette was a symbol of modern Russian naval engineering, designed specifically for littoral zones and river sea operations. It was small enough to navigate the shallow waters of the Volga-Don Canal, yet powerful enough to level a city block from 1,000 miles away. The vessel had just returned from a high-stakes mission. Its vertical launch cells, capable of housing 8 Caliber NK cruise missiles, were empty, having expended their payload in a strategic strike earlier that week. Now, it was in a vulnerable state of resupply. The refueling hoses were connected, the cooling systems were humming to dissipate the heat from the ship's massive diesel engines, and, most critically, the crew was preparing for the complex logistical dance of reloading its primary weapon system. The Caliber NK missile is a terrifying piece of technology. Each unit costs upwards of $1 million and carries a high explosive or thermonuclear warhead. With a range exceeding 1,100 kilometers, 930 miles, a Buyan M docked in Temryuk could theoretically strike Kiev, Lviv, or even targets in Central Europe without ever leaving the pier. This capability made the ship a high-priority target for Ukrainian planners, but its location, over 65 miles from the nearest contesting front line, was supposed to be its ultimate armor. On the deck, the atmosphere was one of relaxed triumph. The promptness of their return and the successful discharge of their missiles had led to a lapse in the usual rigid discipline. A group of senior officers had gathered near the stern, the clinking of vodka glasses cutting through the humid night air. They were celebrating a job well done, confident in the layers of S-400 air defense batteries and electronic warfare jammers that saturated the Taman Peninsula. To them, the war was a distant thunder, something that happened to infantry in trenches, not to the elite missile crews of the fleet. Below deck, the rotation was underway. The Combat Information Center, usually the nerve center of the ship where radar operators scanned for threats, was running on a skeleton crew. Fatigue had set in. The adrenaline of the launch mission had faded, replaced by the heavy exhaustion of prolonged deployments. At the control stations, eyelids were heavy. The rhythmic hum of the ship's generator was a lullaby to sailors who believed they were safe. But safety in 2025 was an illusion. The modern battlefield had evolved, and the concept of a safe harbor was rapidly becoming obsolete. Just over 6 miles away, barely visible against the dark chop of the water, a different kind of vessel was cutting through the waves. It bore no flag, no lights, and no crew. It was a Ukrainian unmanned surface vehicle, USV, a sleek, low-profile drone boat painted in radar-absorbing matte black, bearing civilian markings to blend into the heavy commercial traffic of the Azov Sea during the day. It was now a phantom in the night. This was not a random harassment attack. It was a precision strike mission years in the making. The operator of this drone was not on a nearby ship or a coastal bunker. They were likely hundreds of miles away, perhaps in a secure command center in Kiev or an underground bunker in Odessa, staring at a bank of monitors. The feed from the drone's infrared camera showed the distant glowing heat signature of the Buyan M's exhaust stacks. The target was acquired. To understand the gravity of this moment, one must understand the technological leap Ukraine had made by late 2025. The war had transformed the nation into the world's leading laboratory for unmanned warfare. Early in the conflict, naval drones were improvised, unreliable, and agilely experimental. By August 2025, they were sophisticated weapon systems. This particular drone was likely a variant of the Sea Baby or Magura V5, significantly upgraded with stealth coding, satellite communications that resisted Russian jamming, and a warhead large enough to break the keel of a corvette. The approach was slow and calculated. The drone pilot throttled back to minimize the wake and the acoustic signature. Russian hydrophones, designed to detect the loud cavitation of submarines or large destroyers, struggled to pick up the faint electric whine of the drone's final stage propulsion. The operator navigated through the commercial shipping lanes, using the hulls of anchored freighters as shields against radar detection. As the drone closed the distance to 10 kilometers, the tension in the remote command center would have been palpable. This was the culmination of months of intelligence gathering. Partisans in occupied Crimea and the Krasnodar region had likely tracked the movement of the Buyan M. Schedule, its docking procedures, and the habits of its crew. This human intelligence, HUMINT, was fused with satellite imagery and signals intelligence to create a perfect window of opportunity. The specific time, 03:20 a.m., was chosen for a reason. It is the time of deepest sleep, the circadian low point, when human reaction times are at their slowest. Back on the pier, the reloading process was about to begin. Cranes were moving into position to hoist the massive caliber canisters into the ship's vertical launch system, VLS. This is the most dangerous moment for a warship. The hatches are open, the explosive ordnance is exposed, and the ship is tethered to the shore, unable to maneuver. If an attack were to happen now, the secondary explosions from the missiles on the pier and in the tubes would be catastrophic. The officers on deck were oblivious to the approaching nemesis. Their conversation likely revolved around shore leave, promotions, or the technical aspects of the recent strike. The notion that a Ukrainian boat could bypass the Kerch Strait defenses, navigate the minefields, and enter Temryuk Bay undetected was dismissed as impossible. The Kerch Bridge was heavily guarded, with floating booms, dolphin pens, and constant patrols. However, the Ukrainians had proven time and again that they excelled at the impossible. They had likely utilized a gap in the net, perhaps slipping the drone through during a period of heavy storm activity, or utilizing a new, submersible capabilities that allowed the drone to dive under physical barriers. At 03:15 a.m., 5 minutes before the strike, the drone operator pushed the throttle forward. The silent glide phase was over. Now, it was about speed. The drone's engine roared to life, churning the water as it accelerated to over 40 knots. The noise would now be audible to anyone paying attention, but the distance was closing too fast for it to matter. On the Bayan M, a lookout might have heard the buzzing sound, distinct from the heavy thrum of diesel engines. It sounded like a large speedboat or a low-flying aircraft. Confused, he might have raised his binoculars, scanning the dark horizon. But the drone was low in the water, a mere speck against the Black Sea. By the time the ship's radar picked up the incoming object, it was already inside the dead zone of the ship's defenses. The AK-630M2 Duet close-in weapon system, CIBUS, a rotary cannon capable of firing thousands of rounds per minute, requires seconds to spin up and lock on. In the lethargy of 3:00 a.m., those seconds were an eternity. The radar operators in the Combat Information Center would have seen a sudden blip appear out of the clutter, moving at attack speed. The alarm would have been sounded, a piercing electronic shriek that shattered the calm of the bridge. The officers on the deck froze. The sound of the approaching engine was now a roar. The vodka glasses were lowered. Panic replaced celebration. Shouts of "Contact! Contact port side!" would have echoed across the pier. Crew members scrambling from their bunks were met with the disorienting red light of battle stations, but their bodies were slow to respond. The drone didn't aim for the waterline. It aimed for the vulnerable stern, near the engine room and the missile storage. The operator, watching the feed, made minute adjustments, steering the vessel directly into the side of the Bayan M. At 03:20 mm, the impact occurred. The explosion was not just a detonation, it was an eruption. The drone's warhead, packed with hundreds of kilograms of high-grade explosives, detonated on contact with the corvette's hull. The blast wave tore through the thin steel of the ship, instantly flooding the engine compartment. But the real devastation came a split second later. The shockwave ignited the fuel lines and the volatile propellant of the reloading operations. A massive fireball engulfed the rear of the ship and the adjacent pier. The officers who had been celebrating moments ago were thrown off their feet, the shockwave rupturing eardrums and shattering glass hundreds of meters away. The specialized reloading crane on the pier collapsed, dropping a caliber canister onto the concrete, where it cracked open, adding its fuel to the inferno. The untouchable military pier number 2 was now a disaster zone. The Bayan M, the pride of the fleet, was listing heavily to port. Water rushed into the breach, dragging the $80 million asset down. The cooling systems, which had been humming peacefully, hissed violently as they were submerged in seawater. This event was more than just the loss of a ship. It was a strategic catastrophe for Russia. The Bayan M corvettes were the solution to the ban on large warships passing through the Turkish Straits. Russia relied on these small, heavily armed ships to project power. Losing one in a safe harbor proved that Ukraine could strike anywhere, anytime. The aftermath of the strike revealed the extent of Ukrainian dominance in the naval domain. Without a functional navy in the traditional sense, Ukraine had managed to force the Russian Black Sea Fleet to retreat. First, they were pushed out of the northwestern Black Sea. Then, Sevastopol, the historic headquarters of the fleet, became too dangerous, forcing a relocation to Novorossiysk. Now, even Temryuk, an inland port in the Sea of Azov, was burning. The psychological impact on the Russian command was devastating. Commanders began to mistrust their own defenses. Every shadow on the water, every piece of floating debris, became a potential threat. This paranoia degraded operational efficiency. Ships spent less time at sea and more time cowering behind defensive booms, reducing the frequency of missile strikes on Ukrainian cities. Furthermore, the economic cost was staggering. It wasn't just the $80 million ship or the $1 million missiles. It was the cost of the port infrastructure, the specialized cranes, and the trained crew. Russia's shipbuilding industry, strangled by sanctions, could not easily replace these high-tech vessels. The electronics, sensors, and engines required components that were no longer accessible. A Bayan M lost in 2025 was gone for good. The strike also highlighted the failure of Russian air defenses against low observable surface threats. The Panzer and S-400 systems were designed to look up, not down at the waves. The radar clutter of the bay, with its small fishing boats and choppy water, provided perfect cover for the drone. Ukraine had exploited a blind spot in Russian doctrine that prioritized aerial threats over naval asymmetry. As the sun rose over Temryuk Bay on August 28th, the smoke was still rising from the twisted metal of the pier. The Bayan M was resting on the shallow bottom, its superstructure barely breaking the surface, a blackened monument to complacency. The news of the strike spread rapidly, despite attempts by Russian censors to contain it. Satellite imagery confirmed the destruction, showing the distinct outline of the submerged corvette. For Ukraine, this was a validation of their asymmetric strategy. They had turned the Black Sea into a no-go zone for Russian warships. The message was clear. There is no rear area. There is no sanctuary. Whether in the open ocean or docked in a secure bay, the Russian fleet was being hunted. The hunters were not destroyers or submarines, but silent, unmanned ghosts controlled from a laptop hundreds of miles away. The dominance of Ukraine in this theater of war was not defined by tonnage or number of hulls, but by innovation, intelligence, and the ruthless application of technology. The destruction of the Bayan M at 03:20 a.m. was the final nail in the coffin of Russian naval supremacy in the region. The hunter had become the prey, and the waters of the Azov Sea would never be safe for the invader again. This incident also marked a turning point in the wider conflict. It demonstrated that Ukraine retained the initiative, dictating the time and place of engagement. While the land front remained a grinding war of attrition, the naval war was a masterclass in maneuver and surprise. The destruction of the floating fortress was a signal to the world that control of the sea no longer belonged to the nation with the biggest ships, but to the nation with the smartest weapons. As the investigation into the security breach at Temryuk began in Moscow, heads would roll, commanders would be fired, and security protocols would be tightened. But it was too late. The fear had set in. The Russian sailor, once confident in the might of his fleet, now scanned the horizon with dread, knowing that the next strike could come from anywhere, silent and deadly, just as the vodka was being poured. The strategic brilliance of the Ukrainian operation lay not just in the execution, but in the selection of the target. The Bayan M class was designed specifically to counter the limitations imposed by geography. Russia's internal waterways, the complex system of rivers and canals linking the Caspian, Black, and Baltic seas, allowed these small corvettes to shift between theaters. A Bayan M could launch missiles at Syria from the Caspian, then travel through the Volga-Don Canal to the Sea of Azov to threaten Ukraine. By sinking one in Temryuk, Ukraine was striking at the very mobility that defined Russian naval strategy. Moreover, the timing of the strike, coinciding with the resupply mode, showcased a depth of intelligence penetration that was deeply unsettling for the Kremlin. To know exactly when the ship was refueling and reloading required eyes on the ground, It implied that the local population in the Krasnodar region, or at least elements within it, were leaking critical data to Kiev. The security services would now have to divert resources to hunt for spies within their own borders, further stretching the already thin internal security apparatus. The technological aspect of the drone used in the attack warrants a closer look. By late 2025, the Sea Baby platform had evolved into a modular, multi-role system. Early versions were essentially suicide boats, effective but limited. The 2025 iteration likely possessed a level of autonomy that allowed it to operate in silent mode without a constant data link. This meant it could navigate via inertial guidance or visual terrain matching if the GPS was jammed. The operator would only need to take control for the final terminal phase. This fire and forget capability made electronic warfare defenses largely useless. Additionally, the warhead design had improved. Early strikes often damaged ships, but failed to sink them due to poor impact placement or insufficient explosive mass. The strike on the Bayan M, however, showed a precise understanding of the ship's internal architecture. Striking the engine room and magazine area ensured a mission kill at the very least, and a total hull loss at best. The resulting fire, fueled by the ship's own diesel and munitions, did the rest of the work. The global reaction to the strike was one of quiet admiration from military analysts and shock from naval traditionalists. The age of the large surface combatant was being questioned. If an $80 million corvette could be destroyed by a $200,000 drone, the economics of naval warfare were fundamentally broken for the defender. Ukraine was trading pennies for dollars, bleeding the Russian defense budget dry while keeping its own costs sustainable. In the days following the attack, the Russian Black Sea Fleet effectively ceased to be a projecting force. The remaining ships were dispersed to even more remote ports, further away from the combat zone, rendering their short-range weapons useless and stretching the flight time of their cruise missiles, giving Ukrainian air defenses more time to intercept them. The blockade of Ukrainian grain exports, which Russia had tried to enforce, crumbled completely as insurers and shipping companies realized the Russian Navy could no longer guarantee the safety of its own ships, let alone interdict others. The Battle of Temryuk Bay would go down in history books as a classic example of asymmetric warfare. It was the moment when the underdog, stripped of its conventional navy, used ingenuity and courage to defeat a maritime superpower. The image of the burning corvette, reflected in the dark waters of the Azov Sea, became a symbol of Russian overreach and Ukrainian resilience. But the story doesn't end with the explosion. The ripple effects were felt in the corridors of power in Moscow. The loss of the Buyan M was a personal embarrassment for the naval command, who had assured the political leadership that the Azov Sea was secure. It forced a reallocation of assets. Air defense systems were pulled from the front lines in Donbass and Zaporizhzhia to protect naval bases, weakening the ground defense and opening gaps for Ukrainian army offensives. This interconnectedness of the battlefield meant that a naval strike in Temryuk directly aided the infantry soldier in the trenches of the east. Furthermore, the strike disrupted the logistics of the Kaliber missile campaign. The Bayan M vessels were the trucks that delivered these missiles to their launch points. With one less truck and the others scared to leave port, the frequency of missile strikes on Ukrainian energy infrastructure dropped significantly. This allowed Ukraine to repair its grid and stockpile energy reserves for the winter, blunting one of Russia's primary strategic levers. The success of the operation also boosted the morale of the Ukrainian public and armed forces. After years of grueling warfare, clear-cut victories were essential for maintaining the national will. The news that their forces could reach deep into Russian territory and strike the enemy where they felt safest was a powerful tonic. It reinforced the narrative that victory was inevitable, that time was on Ukraine's side, and that no matter how many resources Russia poured into the war, they could not stop the evolution of Ukrainian tactics. As the wreckage of the Buyan M was eventually salvaged, a melancholy procession of cranes and barges, it served as a grim reminder of the cost of underestimating an adversary. The Russian commanders who had raised their vodka glasses that night had celebrated too soon. They had failed to realize that in the modern era, the war does not end when the ship docks. The war is omnipresent, and in the darkness of the Azov Sea, the eyes of the Ukrainian intelligence services were always watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The legacy of the strike on the Buyan M extended into the development of future naval doctrine worldwide. Navies from the United States to China began to reassess their fleet compositions. The vulnerability of surface ships to cheap, swarming drones became a central topic of defense papers and war games. Ukraine had not just won a battle, they had changed the way the world thought about war at sea. The destruction of the floating fortress was a testament to the shifting tides of the conflict. It was a demonstration that dominance is not about static strength, but about dynamic adaptation. Ukraine, forced by necessity to innovate, had outpaced the lumbering giant of the Russian military machine. And as the smoke cleared over Temryuk, one truth remained. The sea belonged to those who dared to master the new rules of engagement. The specific details of the strike, the 03:20 a.m. timing, the civilian disguise of the drone, the complacency of the crew, paint a vivid picture of a military force that had lost its edge. The Russian Navy, steeped in tradition and reliant on past glories, was ill-equipped to face a nimble, tech-savvy opponent. They were fighting a 20th century war in a 21st century reality. The Buyan M, with its heavy armor and big guns, was a dinosaur facing a sad pack of wolves. The reloading operation, intended to replenish the ship's lethality, became its Achilles' heel. It exposed the rigidity of Russian procedures. They followed a schedule, a predictable pattern that the Ukrainians exploited. In war, predictability is zyuth. The Ukrainians, conversely, were unpredictable. They struck from the air, from the sea, with missiles, with drones, with sabotage. They kept the enemy guessing, forcing them to spread their defenses thin, creating weak points that could be exploited. Temryuk Bay, once a quiet backwater, was now a name etched in naval history. It was the place where the illusion of Russian invulnerability finally drowned. And for the sailors of the Black Sea Fleet, the memory of that night, the flash, the roar, the fire, would haunt them for the rest of the war. They knew that out there in the darkness, the drones were still waiting. The narrative of Ukraine's dominance is further reinforced by the fact that this was not an isolated incident. It was part of a systematic dismantling of the Black Sea Fleet. First the Moskva, then the landing ships, then the submarines, and now the small missile corvettes. Piece by piece, the fleet was being erased. The fleet in being was becoming a fleet in memory. This strategic paralysis of the Russian Navy allowed Ukraine to secure its maritime borders, despite not having a conventional navy. They created a sea denial zone that stretched hundreds of miles from their coast. They protected their grain corridors, ensuring the economic survival of the state. They demonstrated that a nation does not need a cruiser to sink a cruiser. It just needs a better idea. The destruction of the Buyan M in Temryuk Bay on August 28, 2025, serves as the perfect microcosm of the entire war. It pits a heavy, expensive, sluggish Goliath against a small, agile, and innovative David. And just like in the ancient story, the giant fell. The floating fortress was no match for the silent hunter in Chut, the knight. The celebration was premature. The vodka remained unfinished, and the pride of the fleet became a burning wreck on the shores of the Azov Sea. From a technological standpoint, the civilian markings on the drone mentioned in the prompt are a crucial detail. This speaks to the complexities of modern hybrid warfare. Identifying threats in a crowded maritime environment is a nightmare for defenders. A blip on the radar could be a fishing boat, a smuggler, or a kamikaze drone. The hesitation caused by this ambiguity is often fatal. By the time the threat is confirmed, it is too late to engage. This ambiguity was weaponized by Ukraine, turning Russia's own hesitancy against them. The $80 million cost of the vessel is a significant figure, but the replacement cost in 2025 terms would be vastly higher due to inflation, sanctions, and the loss of skilled labor. Russia was burning through its Soviet inheritance and its modern reserves at an unsustainable rate. Every loss like this accelerated the economic collapse of the war effort. It was a war of economics as much as a war of explosives. The resupply mode mentioned is also significant. A ship is most dangerous when it is at sea, but most vulnerable when it is in port. The logistics tail of the Russian Army and Navy had always been their weak link. By targeting the ship during this phase, Ukraine struck at the logistical chain. They turned the port, which should be a place of safety and regeneration, into a death trap. The range of the Caliber missiles, 950 miles, meant that this ship was a strategic threat to the entirety of Ukraine. Removing it from the board saved countless lives. It was a preemptive strike in the truest sense. It stopped future attacks before they could be launched. It was a defensive action with an offensive execution. The events of August 28, 2025, were a masterstroke of modern naval warfare. They showcased Ukraine's dominance through innovation, intelligence, and sheer audacity. The destruction of the Buyan M was not just a naval victory. It was a statement of intent. It declared that Ukraine would not be cowed by long-range missiles or floating fortresses. They would find a way to fight back, and they would win. The silence of the Temryuk night was broken by the sound of freedom defending itself, leaving the aggressor broken and burning in the bay. The Alaska summit mentioned in historical records of the time, August 2025, between the US and Russian leadership had set a tense backdrop. Russia was trying to negotiate from a position of strength, using its missile capabilities as leverage. The destruction of a key missile carrier right after such high-level talks undercut Putin's bargaining power. It showed the world and the American delegation that Russia's military might was brittle. This embarrassment likely caused friction within the Kremlin. The discrepancy between the reports given to the president that the fleet was secure and the reality, burning ships in rear areas, would have fueled the internal purges that characterized the late war period in Russia. Distrust between the political leadership and the military command paralyzed decision-making. Commanders became afraid to take risks, afraid to report bad news, and afraid to innovate. This stagnation was the death knell for the Russian war effort. Ukraine, on the other hand, was operating with a decentralized mission command philosophy. The operators of the drone unit were likely given a broad objective: degrade Kaliber launch capability, and the freedom to execute it as they saw fit. This flexibility allowed them to adapt to the situation on the ground, or water, in real time. They didn't need to ask permission from a general in Kiev to strike when they saw the target. They just struck. The technological dominance of Ukraine was also evident in the electronic warfare domain. For the drone to maintain control and video feed at that range, in a hostile environment saturated with Russian jammers, implies a breakthrough in communications technology. Perhaps they were using laser-linked relays, or advanced frequency hopping algorithms, or even AI-driven autonomous terminal guidance that didn't require a signal at all. This technological edge was something Russia, isolated by sanctions, could not replicate. The celebration on the deck serves as a powerful literary and historical motif. It represents the hubris of the occupier. Throughout history, military disasters have often been preceded by overconfidence. The Japanese before Midway, the French before Agincourt, the Russians at Temryuk. The belief that it can't happen to us is the most dangerous mindset in warfare. The Ukrainian operators, sitting in their dark room, were the antithesis of this. They were focused, professional, and patient. They waited for the celebration to start before they ended it. In the weeks that followed, the wreck of the Buyan M was likely fenced off, hidden from public view. But the locals knew. The families of the sailors knew. The rumor mill in Russia, fueled by telegram channels and VPN-accessed news, spread the story. It contributed to the growing sense of war fatigue in the Russian population. The promise of a quick, special operation had dragged into years of burning ships and dead sons. The social contract between the regime and the people was fraying. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, the footage of the strike, captured by the drone's own camera right up to the moment of impact, would have been broadcast to the world. It was a propaganda coup. It showed the donors in the West that their investment was yielding results. It showed the global South that Russian equipment was vulnerable. It showed the Ukrainian people that their defenders were capable of striking back hard. The dominance of Ukraine in the naval sphere effectively turned the Black Sea into a NATO lake, in all but name. With the Russian fleet hiding in port, the sea lanes were open for trade, for aid, and eventually, for reconstruction materials. The economic stranglehold Russia had tried to apply to Ukraine had been broken by a small boat with a camera and a warhead. As we look back at the timeline of the war, August 28, 2025, stands out as a pivotal date. It was the day the river-sea strategy of the Russian Navy died. The Buyan M, designed to project power from internal waters, became a victim of those very waters. It was trapped, cornered, and destroyed. The hunter became the hunted, and the world watched in awe as Ukraine, the nation without a navy, ruled the waves. The operational security, OPSEC, of the Ukrainian side was flawless. The fact that a drone could travel that distance without being detected suggests not just stealth technology, but a deep understanding of Russian radar coverage gaps. They threaded the needle. They knew where the blind spots were. They knew the shift change schedules. They knew the weather patterns. It was a symphony of planning and execution. The financial disparity of the engagement is worth reiterating. An $80 million asset neutralized by a drone, costing a fraction of that amount. This asymmetry is unsustainable for any nation, let alone one under heavy sanctions. Russia simply could not build ships fast enough to replace the ones Ukraine was sinking. The math of the war was undeniably in Ukraine's favor. Moreover, the training required to operate these drones was significantly less than the training required to crew a warship. A Buyan-M requires a crew of over 50 highly trained sailors and officers. Losing them is a loss of human capital that takes years to replace. A drone operator can be trained in months and operates from safety. This preservation of skilled personnel was another key factor in Ukraine's long-term dominance. The wreckage of the Buyan-M would eventually rust away, becoming part of the artificial reef in Temryuk Bay. But the lesson it taught would remain. Taught the world that in the age of autonomy, size does not equal safety. It taught that a determined nation, fighting for its survival, can overcome insurmountable odds through innovation and courage. And it taught the Russian commanders that there is no celebration until the war is truly over. And for them, on that August night, the war had only just begun to show its true, terrifying face. The story of the Buyan-M in Temryuk Bay is the story of the Ukraine war in miniature. A technologically superior but tactically rigid giant being taken apart piece by piece by a nimble, adaptive, and relentless opponent. It is a story of hubris and nemesis. And it is a story that confirms Ukraine's status as the dominant force in the conflict, dictating the terms of engagement and rewriting the history of naval warfare, one drone strike at a time. The floating fortress was gone, and with it, the last vestiges of Russian naval dominance. The sea was Ukrainian. One additional layer to consider is the environmental impact, often overlooked in war scripts, but relevant to the reality of the scene. The burning fuel and sinking munitions would have caused localized pollution in the bay, affecting the fishing industry that the local population relied on. This adds another dimension to the Russian failure. Not only did they lose a military asset, but they also failed to protect their own environment and economy in the rear. The locals, watching the oil slick spread, would feel the consequences of their government's war directly on their shores. The specific mention of the cooling system in the prompt is a great detail. These systems are loud. They create a thermal signature. For a heat-seeking drone or an operator using thermal imaging, a ship in resupply mode with cooling systems active stands out like a beacon against the cooler water. The ship was literally broadcasting its position. The Russian crew, comfortable in their secure zone, failed to enforce light and thermal discipline. They behaved as if they were at peace, while their enemy was very much at war. The high-speed boat-bearing civilian markings is a detail that suggests the drone might have been a modified commercial hull, or disguised to look like one. This is a classic guerrilla tactic adapted for the sea. It forces the enemy to hesitate. Is that a fisherman? Is that a smuggler? Or is it a bomb? In the split second it takes to decide, the drone closes the gap. By the time the realization hits, the explosion is inevitable. If you want more real breakdowns of how this war is unfolding and why moments like this matter, like the video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's next.